different types of regions. Okay, first, a region is an area that has some sort of common cultural, what we call human characteristic, or some sort of physical geography or environmental characteristics. So a way we could kind of think of this is if we talk about Denver and we say Denver or the metropolitan area of Denver. So Denver, Aurora, Littleton, Highlands Ranch, all of those put together is an area. And if we say a human characteristic, and we say what is like a human or cultural characteristic, we would say, okay, well, what language do most people speak in that region? And you would say English. And even if I said what's the second language that they're most likely to speak, you would probably say Spanish. So that's a human characteristic, or what we call a cultural characteristic. And then an environmental or physical geography characteristic, again, if we were using the Denver metropolitan area, we would say that the Denver metro area, typically anywhere you go within that region, typically has dry air. We would say that it's hot in the summer and kind of cool in the winter, and that it's a decently high elevation. Doesn't matter where you go in that area, in that region, that's a common characteristic. There's always mountains to the west. So that would be a common environmental or physical geographical characteristic that make up a region. But again, very simply put, a region is just an area with common features. In this class, we are going to focus on three different types of regions that have interest to us, and that is a formal region, a functional region, and a vernacular, or what is sometimes called a perceptual region. And so that'll be the basis of this short lecture. Now I'm going to come back to this picture that you see up there because it is one of the three types of regions, formal, functional, or vernacular, and so I'll cover that shortly. Okay, first, a formal region. A formal region is a region in which the characteristic, whatever characteristic that we're talking about, is a dominant characteristic throughout the entire region. So if we were to talk about Colorado, Colorado is a formal region. It's clearly defined, and that's oftentimes we look for a formal region that it's clearly defined. And whenever you talk about a country, or in this case, a province, which Americans wrongly call, but that's okay, we'll talk about that later, a state. The state of Colorado is clearly defined, and there are things that are common throughout Colorado. And so if we said like mountains would not be what make Colorado a formal region. So what makes Colorado a formal region? So a good example of this would be that no matter where we go throughout the clearly defined region of Colorado, you have to be 16 years old to be able to drive. And it doesn't matter if you're in Grand Junction, it doesn't matter if you're in Alamosa or Lamar or Denver or Sterling or wherever you are, everywhere you go throughout that region, it's the characteristic is the same. And in this case, that characteristic means you have to be 16 years old to drive a car. So that would be one example of what would make Colorado a formal region. Another example, if you need for your key term slides, would be the United States. And again, the United States has clearly defined boundaries. It's something to where not everything is going to make the United States a formal region, but if you think about something like, citizenship. Citizenship, if you are born in the United States, if you're born within the boundaries of the United States, even if your parents are not, you are considered a United States citizen and you are afforded all the rights of the Bill of Rights and all of those kind of things. So that would be another example of a formal region. I'm going to go back to the previous slide because this type of formal region is a little less clear. Whenever you have boundaries and a characteristic is the same throughout the boundary, well, that makes it easy. You know it's a formal region. But here's a good example of something that's a formal region that maybe not as clear. And so if you're looking at this picture, and I'm just going to use my kind of pin function here. And so if I go throughout the Old South here, that did not work very well. I'm really trying to go just over the cotton belt. So we're going to focus on that area there. I want you to look at the old cotton belt. That was a miserable failure on my part of the pen, but we're looking at just the old cotton belt there. That cotton belt that you see in sort of that tan color, that is a formal region as well. And the reason it's a formal region is that cotton is a common characteristic throughout that region, and it's a dominant characteristic. That doesn't mean that cotton is the only thing grown in that particular area, but everywhere I go within that area that shaded the old cotton belt, the number one crop that's going to be grown in those areas is overwhelmingly going to be cotton. And so that could make it a formal region as well. I think AP tries not to use this type of region as much because it's not quite as clear. But once you understand the other type of region, functional and vernacular, you can pretty clearly see that this is not either one of those. And so that's what makes it a formal region. Okay, the next region is a functional region. Now this one's much easier to understand. So in a functional region, there's some sort of, we're going to call it a phenomenon. It's a whatever it is. So a phenomenon can really be kind of an anything that's, a human characteristic or a physical geographical characteristic. And what makes it a functional region is that there's a node. There's a kind of a central point. And so if you look down on that map down below, you can see that there are little cities or towns, and that serves as kind of the central node of the functional region. All right. So what we tend to say in a functional region is that the closer you are to the node, that characteristic is more dominant. And the farther away you get, the less predominant that characteristic is. And so I always like to use, for the example, the Denver Broncos. And so if I was talking about a concentration of Denver Broncos fans, I want you to think about, before I put this up on the screen, where would we typically find the most Denver Broncos fans? And if you're sitting there going, well, this is easy, the answer is Denver. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much true. So if I kind of put it into a formal example, if I'm in Denver, I'm going to find the highest concentration of Denver Broncos fans around Empower Field. Empower Field is the stadium that the Broncos play at. That's kind of the central node. Or Dove Valley, where the Broncos have their facility where they practice. That's a node. And if I'm around that node, that characteristic is very dominant, it's very high. But as I move farther away from Denver and I start getting out towards Kansas and I get to Sterling and Julesburg and some of these places you may never know about, but I'm getting closer to the Kansas border, the number of people that support the Denver Broncos is getting less and less and less. And then once I get into Kansas, well, now I start to get into another region. I may have some fans that are Denver Broncos fans, but now I'm getting a higher concentration of fans that are Kansas City Chiefs. And as I get closer to Kansas City, I get a higher concentration of Kansas City Chiefs fans. Likewise, something that you've probably noticed in your lifetime, if you're ever listening to the radio, when you're near the station or a station tower, the radio station is very clear. And so whatever that station is or the station tower, that's the node. And that's where the characteristic is the strongest. But as you drive away from that, say, or you walk away or whatever the case may be, that radio signal is going to get less and less. Well, what we should recognize is that where the most people listen to that radio station is right around that station. And so that's where the characteristic is the strongest. You may have noticed if you're listening to a Denver radio station and you're driving up to, say, Fort Collins or even past that, you'll notice that the station starts to fade out, and that actually you can start picking up other radio stations on that same station. And as you drive closer to that station, then you'll totally lose the one you were listening to, and the one that came into the station will be much stronger. So that's a functional region. So once again, it's a region in which you have some sort of phenomenon. In one of my examples, it was Denver Broncos, and the others, it was radio station. Around that node, the characteristic is very strong, and as you move away from it, that characteristic gets less and less strong. Okay, and then our last region is going to be what we call a vernacular or perceptual region. And I use perceptual region. It's not always used by AP, but it's a good way to think about it because you know a word. Vernacular is kind of a different word for you, but perceptual, you can link with the word perception. What is your view of it? And so that's literally what this type of region is. Like, what is your view of the region? Where do you say it begins and where do you say it ends? And I know that sounds kind of weird, but that's that's pretty much what the region is. So I want you to think of, like downtown. Most of you guys have been to downtown Denver. If I were to ask you where does downtown exist, like what is the area that makes up downtown? And for some of you, that's going to be very different than others. Some of you are going to say, something like, well, if I look at this picture here, downtown begins when the buildings get over, I don't know, 5 stories high. Some of you might say, no. The downtown does not begin until you get to 10 stories high or 15 stories high. And some of you just may say, well, when the traffic starts to get really bad, that's the beginning of downtown. But the point is, there's no definitive border to where a particular phenomenon, in this case, downtown, where it begins and ends. It's kind of where your perception is of it. If you want to think of it another way, think of the South. Now, I realize that this map has an area that kind of has the color put into it already, but when you traditionally think of the South, and you think of things like Southern dialect, the way they speak, you think of sports like NASCAR and college football, do you think of New Mexico? Is that what you think of the South? Or do you think more of places like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana? But the point here is, where does it end? Where does it end? Is Arkansas part of the South? And for that matter, is Missouri? If you take a look at Missouri on our map, and let me see how much better I'm going to be able to use the pen here. Oh gosh, this is way off. There, I made an arrow. There is Missouri. Okay, is Missouri the South? They entered the Union as a slave state back in 1820. They did grow cotton. They did have slavery. Does that make it the South? Because if you go to northern Missouri, well, gosh, you're like almost up north of like Kansas and Nebraska. So, do you consider Missouri the South? Do you consider Maryland the South? And so really, when you think of a perceptual region, it really boils down to what your perception of the area looks like. And, to define that region, you look at the characteristics. Do you go by things in the South like humidity? Do you go by elevation, low elevation, or, climate or something like that, or how the people act? So that is a perceptual region. Okay, this ends the lecture on regions. And what I would advise you to do, and what I would advise you always to do, is to have those key term cards available, or as soon as you get finished with taking notes or watching this video PowerPoint, fill out the corresponding key terms that go along with this. So if you go to your key term slides and fill out all these different regions, and then you're set to go.